Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the next installment of the NACDA Social Justice in College Athletics series. I am NACDA CEO Bob Vecchione, and we're so glad you could join us today to continue these important conversations around difficult topics in our industry and in the world. The goal of the NACDA Social Justice in College Athletics initiative is to provide a platform with valuable resources for collegiate athletics administrators during a time of transformative change in history. As we seek to collectively listen, learn, and strive for equality and turn words into actions as we move forward. Through the assistance of NACDA leaders, including Ward Manuel, our current president and director of athletics at the University of Michigan, Alan Greene, our moderator today, director of athletics at Auburn University, Lee Reed, Director of Athletics at Georgetown University, and current MOA President China Jude, Senior Associate AD, SWA at the University of Wyoming. We look forward to bringing you virtual sessions on social justice related topics each month so that we can address these social issues and ultimately improve the experience for student athletes and fellow colleagues alike. Today's session, titled The Impact of Black Lives Matter Movement in a Campus Environment, will provide a deeper understanding of the purpose and origination of this movement. We're pleased to have Alan Greene join us to moderate this conversation with Dr. Alvin Tillery, Director of the Center for Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. Dr. Tillery's research and teaching interests are in the fields of American politics and political theory. His research in American politics focuses on American political development, racial and ethnic politics, and media and politics. His research in political theory focuses on American political thought and critical race theory. His book, Between Homeland and the Motherland, Africa, U.S. Foreign Policy, and Black Leadership in America, won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. His papers have appeared in Studies in American Political Development, Political Research Quarterly, and the Journal of Black Studies. He's currently completing a book that examines African American attitudes towards immigration between 1850 and 1865. Dr. Tillery, thank you for taking time to join us today. Before we begin, I want to remind you that all of our live attendees can ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end of this presentation. So once again, thank you. And Alan, the floor is yours.
Bob, thank you so much for the opportunity. Dr. Tillery, Al, as I know you're one of those doctors that is also kind of casual. So yes, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and looking forward to the discussion and to illuminate some of the things and maybe make us think about Black Lives Matter in a way that we haven't before. So knowing that our time is limited, we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. I'm gonna go ahead and jump right in. Okay. And Al, I'm not even gonna ask you just one question. I'm gonna start off by asking you 3 questions. That's how much I respect you in your work. So if you don't mind, can you spend a few moments just talking about what is the Black Lives Matter movement? If you can talk about a little bit about how it started, and then what do Americans think about it?
Yeah, well, Alan, thank you for those thoughtful questions. But before I dive into that, I just want to thank you and Bob for the invitation to address this esteemed audience. I want to thank Katie for the work that she's done in the background. It's been a pleasure working with you guys, and I'm so delighted to be here to talk to you about this incredibly weighty and important topic that is in the news every day. It's going to be on the minds of our students when they return to campus, whether virtually or in person. And I just want to highlight for people, you know, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, this week, 4 young people's lives have been indelibly altered by what's happening in terms of police brutality and in terms of protesting and counter-protesting. And so this is a very, very weighty and emotional subject. And so I'm happy to have the opportunity to try to lend my expertise to raise everyone's level and consciousness about what's happening. So your first question, you know, what is the movement? The Black Lives Matter movement is many things, honestly. It's at its core, it's a grassroots movement for police reform that emerged first in social media. In 2012, a very brilliant African-American professor at UCLA named Marcus Anthony Hunter posted hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter. And at that time, it didn't gain very much traction. About a year later, the movement was elevated in the summer of 2013 when Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors posted in a joint post on Twitter, hashtag Black Lives Matter, in the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal in the shooting death of African-American teenager Trayvon Martin in Florida. And so it's really there where the hashtag began to gain traction on social media. It's been tweeted, more than 35 million times. It is one of the top 3 most utilized hashtags on social media. And so, from the hashtag and from social media usage, the so-called Black Lives Matter movement as we know it, which has been hundreds and hundreds of protests in American cities and towns, really began in earnest in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, with the response to the shooting death of Michael Brown, and then later that summer in Baltimore. And what we've seen is 2 large waves of protests that have been sustained in one period from 2013 when Trayvon Martin was killed to 2016 with the election. And then again, starting this summer with the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, everyone being at home during the pandemic and watching, the George Floyd killing on television really galvanized a new dimension of the movement. And that's what we're in the middle of now, is this second massive wave of protests for police reform. And frankly, it's also about a lot of other things, and we'll dig into that at some point as well. But what Americans think about it, when the first wave of the protests happened in 2014 and 2015, there was what we call racial bifurcation in terms of how people thought of it. African Americans, by and large, supported the movement, even if they didn't really know where it was going, because they have a lot of experience with police brutality and with hyper aggressive policing in their neighborhoods. And so that was, had a very strong favorable response in the Black community. Whites were pretty ambivalent about the movement. Something on the order of 30 to 40% supported it, depending on the polls. White Democrats were much more likely to support it than Republicans. And so, that's where we were in the first wave. With the second wave, after the George Floyd killing went viral, we have had very, very high levels of support across the board. People, saying that they support police accountability and reform measures. But as the summer wears on and we're starting to see the movement co-opted in certain places, like in Portland, for example, you see Portland's a place where almost no Black people live. And what we see is that, very robust protests of young white people in the streets who are upset about a lot of things. Yes, they're upset about police brutality, but they're also upset about climate change, the rent in Portland being too high, and with sort of federal officials kettling them in ways that lead these protests to turn violent. I think that we're going to begin to see something of an erosion of support for those people who are new to the movement, particularly for older people like the baby boomers and the Gen Xers. Frankly, millennials and Gen Z are squarely supportive of the movement, which is why we see a robust, young, multiracial crowd in the streets in this second wave of protests. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that, that's going to continue because of what I know about the attitudes of those generations. But it's also going to continue because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of our society in general. And these young people who are the age of our students are going to continue in this fashion. And so that's where we are in terms of a summary of what's happening.
That's great. Thank you. So you had mentioned a couple of things I want to build on, and you talked about I'll use the word politicization, right? You
Yeah.
talked a bit about Democrats and Republicans,
Yes.
and blacks and whites, and the way that a word I've been using more is positionality, right?
Yes.
These things are starting to come into play. And
Yes.
so what we start to see is Black Lives Matter has become divisive. And why highlight Black Lives Matter when in theory all lives matter? And how do we wrap our brains around the distinction?
Yeah, so I mean that's the language of the opponents, right? The people who say, well, to say that Black Lives Matter is divisive. Well, I mean that's really a proposition that doesn't hold a lot of water. The country is founded on violent protests in defense of life, liberty, and property. So everyone has a right to say, frankly, that their life matters. Everyone within that larger subset. Of course, all lives matter, but the Black Lives Matter movement and the slogan is in response to the reality that in a society that's structured from its foundation on anti-Black, anti-brown racism, we have real problems in our society that statistics bear out, that our eyes bear out. We have, a situation where, Black men are 2.5 times more likely to die than white men are in exchanges with the police. And so, that is what the Black Lives Matter hashtag and slogan and campaign is about. It's about addressing in a rational way the problems with racist policing or racially unequal outcomes in policing. And so to say all lives matter in that context, I think is really inappropriate. And so the example that I like to give when I visit, with colleges and universities where I know there are a lot of rivalries in sports. So I did a talk for my own home department, Northwestern athletics, earlier in the summer, and so I would frame the inappropriateness of all lives matter in this way. If we know, for example, that Northwestern, God forbid, were ravaged by a tornado or a tsunami, and there was a loss of property, life, etc. And people supportive of Northwestern started posting online Northwestern Strong or Northwestern Lives Matter or Protect Northwestern. I don't think most people would find that offensive, right? But then if, say, all of the Big Ten schools started saying, well, wait a minute, Northwestern is really just a subset of the Big Ten schools. So they shouldn't say Northwestern matters or Northwestern lives matter. They should say the Big Ten matters, right? And I'm insulted that you said Northwestern matters only. What, right? Well, the tsunami didn't hit Wisconsin or Michigan, or the tsunami hit Northwestern. And so we're dedicating special attention to Northwestern in that context, because logically, that's what is required at this time. And so if you don't believe that unequal policing is real, despite the hundreds and hundreds of videos that we've seen before our eyes, right? Dylan Roof goes and shoots 9 innocent worshipers after praying with them in Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, shoots them all dead. Clementa Pinckney, the pastor, and everyone else. He is taken to jail after the police are able to de-escalate that very quickly. And on the way, they stop and get him a Happy Meal from Burger King, literally, right? Let's look at what happened to Mr. Blake in Kenosha earlier in the week, or Mr. Floyd, right? And so at the root of the Black Lives Matter movement is this concern: why do Black and brown bodies get a differential care ethic from state officials than white bodies? And so to say all lives matter when we see before our eyes that the dilemma is with the Black lives not mattering to state authorities, it's just irrational. And what it's rooted in is essentially sort of anti-Blackness. And the people who are bothered by the slogan Black Lives Matter, our surveys show us the people most bothered by that are also bothered by the presence of Black people in this society, breathing, walking, working. And so that's something that we need to interrogate if we're going to ever make these changes in a positive way. And the way that I always do it, I give talks like this a lot. And so people always say, well, I'm not a racist, and I think that all lives matter is more appropriate. And I say, well, that's great. I agree with you that Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. Can you tell me where I can go to join the next All Lives Matter protest to protect Black bodies from police brutality? And people always look at me quizzically. Well, what do you mean? Well, Black Lives Matter is a real movement. If All Lives Matter is a movement, where can I go to the rallies that are being held under the banner of All Lives Matter so that I can say, I want to join up with all these other lives? Well, those rallies don't exist, right? Because what our research in the social sciences shows us is that the hashtag All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, they are really only deployed on Twitter as a way to discipline people saying saying Black Lives Matter, right? And so, the great communication scholar Dean Freelon at American University has done work where he's tracked when these hashtags come into dialogue, and people are really only tweeting All Lives Matter in response to someone else saying Black Lives Matter, right? It's not a real movement. It's just meant to discipline people who are focused on Black lives. And that's deeply troubling in my view.
Yeah, you brought up some good points, Al, and I've heard and watched videos so that I can educate myself on Black Lives Matter, and not necessarily even the movement or the organization, not that there is an organization per se, but trying to help other people understand why the Black Lives Matter movement is important, why it's real. And one of the examples I saw in an article from several years ago was Boston Strong, right? Then
yes, exactly.
The marathon was bombed and everyone was wanting to rock Boston Strong shirts. Well, what about the other marathons? What about the other cities?
Exactly, Alan. Exactly.
All cities are strong. And it seems that some of those who believe that all lives matter is more appropriate, perhaps they don't recognize or acknowledge that Black lives are under attack. So if I'm a white person, I've never lived around Black folks, I've never interacted, and all that I see is the news at the front, the top story is another Black person arrested or shot or murdered or whatever, then I say, well, they're doing it to themselves.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about, as a white person, I don't see, it's not close to me, so I don't see it, so it's not really true.
Yeah, and I think that's what's different about the 2020 protest cycle, is that everyone was at home, and these videos have been ubiquitous in our culture since Tamir Rice, Eric Garner. African Americans and sort of young progressive whites can list 30 names, right, of people that they have watched these videos and protested about, but most people have not been paying attention to this, right? And so for most people, it's grafted onto the broader structure of racial inequalities in our country. And most people haven't interrogated the nature of those inequalities. They don't deal with the reality that these inequalities are not accidental. They were constructed by governments beginning in the late 19th century. And that's even before you get to the conversation of the fact that the country, probably the wealth of a lot of the universities that are listening in on this call, the wealth of those universities, a good many of them are tied to either slavery itself, right, as Georgetown found, Harvard found, or they're tied to land grants that were given away to people in the Middle West because they did not want Black people to move there. So the land grants are all about the Homestead Act. All of that is about suppressing Black freedom and movement as well. And so if you live in an area where you know the Black and brown neighborhoods are spatially demarcated as the other side of the tracks, that's not accidental. And that's what people like me spend our lives studying and pointing out to people. So if you've never had that conversation about, well, why is it there are no jobs in a place like Inglewood on the south side of Chicago? Why in a Democratic city, and this is what Mr. Trump asks this question all the time, why in cities controlled by the Democrats are there these, these dead zones where there are no jobs, and so that's intentional, right? And so, both parties have been involved in, creating this dilemma through government power. And so if you haven't dealt with that, if you haven't dealt with unequal capitalism, right, it's going to be hard for you to get to understanding that these police inequalities are fundamentally rooted in the first order racial inequalities that exist. So hyperpolicing is about protecting the segregation lines that exist between Black and brown neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, right? Hyperpolicing is about disciplining the poor because we've all decided that we don't want to pay higher taxes and spend money on economic development in those communities, right? And so this is why you get higher policing, hyperpolicing in these areas. And so, but when we begin to ask some real common sense questions, has, people who want to help student athletes, you begin to chip away at that irrationality. So a lot of our athletes come from these hyper-policed neighborhoods in these areas. Are they bad people? Are their parents whom you're in their living room trying to recruit them? Are they bad people? Are they failing as individuals, or has society failed them, right? How many of your athletes have had guns pulled on them by police officers or been, Terry stopped? I grew up in an affluent household. I went to Morehouse College and Harvard. I have had every advantage in my life from day one, and I've still had police officers point a gun at my temple over a blown out headlight because they didn't believe I belonged in a certain neighborhood, right? And so the policing problems are partly about enforcing the racial stratification that we have in our society. And if you're not willing to open your eyes and see that, you're probably not going to understand why people are upset about hyper-aggressive policing.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned student athletes, and I want to get there in a second. But before we get to student athletes, let me share a little bit about what happened on Auburn's campus a few months ago, and then help you explain to us some common reaction. Yeah. So our football team was coming back to campus, a week or so after George Floyd was murdered, and they had seen riots and protests, peaceful,
and riots,
explosive, literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
And our student athletes are sitting at home watching this. Yeah. And so they come to campus and they want to be a part of this change, this movement.
Yeah.
And so, our football coach and myself had a conversation. We decided to participate in a protest, peaceful protest in our community. And we've seen other coaches, football coaches, and other coaches and student athletes take part in these peaceful protests to help educate. Yeah. We've seen Black Lives Matter T-shirts that Black kids are wearing. Suburban white soccer moms are wearing signs that infuriated by what they've seen, and there's this feeling that there's an awakening of social unrest and social injustice in America that some people hadn't had a chance to see before.
Yes.
And with all this activity around Black Lives Matter, with disruptions and violence, and with various interviews, we've gotten the response on our campus, and I know others have too, because I've had conversations with some of the colleagues, from our wealthy white donors who happen to grow up, if not in the 60s, have parents, right? They're one generation removed from the 60s,
Yes.
who say, well, the Black Lives Matter movement is Marxist.
Yes.
And I don't support that.
Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but that organization, like they're about some crazy stuff.
Yes.
How do we rationalize that, and how do we put our arms around the Marxist Black Lives movement that is destroying America?
Yeah, so I mean that's the kind of the Fox News, disinformation line, right? That's the line that, politicians who want to counter the movement are going to use to harm it. And frankly, the reason that we're having that conversation points to what I see as the fundamental weakness of the Black Lives Matter movement. The theory of the case for the Black Lives Matter movement is that you don't need national leaders. You don't need a national agenda. Everyone should be doing these things locally, defining what it means to them, and that's the way that we can be more closely connected with the people really want. It's actually a very conservative ideology, right? If you think about it, and so the problem with that is that if you don't have national leaders, if you have no one with the moral authority to speak with a unitary voice about your movement, is what happened in Portland can happen. You can be co-opted, right? There's no one that can call on a national level for protesters to stand down when either it becomes a riot on their own or when they're provoked into rioting by police, as some police departments have done to generate headlines that will be favorable to them because the police are engaged in politics, police unions, right? And so the weakness of the Black Lives Matter movement is that the young people that started it don't really have a game plan for the next phases. Now they've gotten these young multiracial crowds out into the street. They've been there for 100 days, but they don't have a game plan for negotiation or for settling when they can't get what they want, right? And it's not even clear that they all want the same thing. So that is, something that what you and your leadership team did at Auburn, it's up to the grown-ups to say, okay, we hear you, we share your concerns. At the core of this movement is a desire to end racist policing and police brutality. We support that. We're going to channel it over here, right? Now, so that's the one dimension of it. Now, the disinformation about it being all Marxist, first I'll say Marxism is a legal ideology, even in the United States, right? And so, yes, there are some people with Marxist sentiments that were elevated to, prominence in the first wave of the movement. One is a young woman named Patrisse Cullors, who talked about being involved in the Occupy movement and having learned, about Marxism and wanting sort of, a more, just capitalism and a reform of American capitalism. The reality is that as a leaderless movement, Patrisse Cullors, who's been nowhere on television about, in this second wave, doesn't speak for the movement, but the opponents of the movement are going to single on her one comment and say, oh, it's Marxist, we can't support it. And, there's nothing that you can do about that. But what I will say is that the average American does way more to support the most Marxist entity on earth, the Chinese government, every time they buy a cell phone or download something from the App Store. If you go into your pocket and if you have the $700 iPhone or Android, communist China is profiting from that. So that's way more to support Marxism, than putting on a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, which, because it's not a Marxist movement, right? And so, but the broader problem is that people are programmed to have responses about this movement based on their racial ideology, because we live in a racialized society. A lot of people in power today, baby boomers and Gen Xers, grew up in segregated America, where the big, happy, smiling Aunt Jemima slave was the syrup bottle. And nobody thought anything about that. Young people have had a different K through 12 education. And this is why you see multiracial crowds into the street. I remember when the Ferguson uprising was happening in 2014, my class of 9 students, there were 8 whites and 1 black girl, and they all came to me on the first week and said, "Professor, we're going to skip class this week." And I said, "Well, that's pretty bold. Say more." They said, we're renting a van to drive down to the Ferguson uprisings. And I was like, "Why are you doing that? Like, are you?" And they're like, "We believe in the movement," right? And so young white millennials cite climate change and racial justice as their top 2 imperatives for this country. And so if those of us who are older don't help them push this energy to something more productive, it's going to be continued chaos, and we're going to risk losing a generation. And so that's where I'll end, because I know we're running up on time.
Yeah, well, so you said a couple of times about the youth, and there's been some questions that have come in about our student athletes, and all of us on this call are in this industry to support our young people.
Yes.
And if we have young white millennials who are concerned about climate change and race, and we've got young Black athletes who are in the most visible sports that we have on our campuses.
Yes.
How do we help them deal and manage with? I know you mentioned it a little bit, but
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about their perspective on what they expect from us as administrators.
Well, I mean, I think that it's hard work. And I mean, I don't want to say that I have all the answers, because this is what I'm navigating with my own students. And so I think we've got to try to understand their perspective as best as we can, and understand that while climate change and racial justice are among their top 2 issues, capitalism in America has not been structured in such a way to provide millennials and Gen Z generations with as much opportunity as it did to our generation and our parents and grandparents' generations. And so part of the appeal of someone like a Bernie Sanders, or the appeal of someone like a Mr. Trump, is that they're talking about the ways in which people have been left behind. And so we've got to understand that this generation is very sensitive to these kinds of existential concerns, and we can't just tamp it down, and say, "Oh, just go vote," or "Oh, just stay peaceful." We've got to understand that we should say those things, but we have to understand that there's a lot of fear and feelings and anxiety behind their response, just as there's a lot of fear and feelings and anxiety among those of us who grew up in a segregated America watching Kenosha burn, right? And so navigating all of these feelings in a productive way that's the responsibility of those of us in leadership positions on campus. And so I would start there, and then I would say provide them with alternatives to express themselves in positive ways. Because when you don't do that, and because there's no one in this Black Lives Matter movement telling people really what to do, it's amorphous, it can lead to really, really tragic outcomes, like what we saw in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Now, I appreciate you addressing some of that, because there was a question that had come in that talked about how do you help, especially the Black student athletes who are at predominantly white institutions in predominantly white communities who have gone through the experiences that you have spoken about. I know experiences that I've gone through as well. And so making sure that they have a safe space to be their authentic selves, for them to be able to get things off their chest. And then, Alvin, if you don't mind, just talk a little bit about the expectations of the institution, right? So we are the front porch of many of our campuses.
Yeah.
We've got student bodies that are larger and perhaps less diverse, but yet our athletes represent the name on the front of the jersey.
Yes.
So what do they expect of our leaders at the institution to do?
Well, I mean, this is a problem. And so I do a fair amount of consulting work, as I think you know. And so a lot of times I go into organizations where there's a mismatch between the top leaders, the old gray hairs that, are funding everything, the kind of middle level leaders, the people that are running the day-to-day operations, and then the team, which are the students, the workers, what have you, right? And so getting those three constituencies on the same page is often the hardest thing to do for generating an authentic and meaningful institutional response, because the young people on the bottom, they want the moon. They want you to lasso the moon and bring it down. And you can't do that because you've got liability. You're old enough to know that things work out through negotiation. And so you've got to convince them that, you're willing to respond in such a way that treats seriously what they want, but you can't necessarily give them everything, right? If I had a magic wand, I couldn't wave it and abolish the police, right? I mean, the irony is we've got young college students from Northwestern and Loyola stopping traffic on the main road that leads between Evanston and Chicago every day at 5 p.m., miles away from where all these police brutality and shootings are happening. And they're saying, abolish the police. You go to Inglewood and you've got pastors there and people saying, actually, maybe this idea of bringing federal agents in to help us with gun violence is not completely crazy, right? And so you can't just respond by giving the students what they say is the right action, right? Because that may not necessarily be the right action. The right action has to be negotiated between these three constituencies. But what I do know is that what the people at the top want, which is often nothing, shut up and play, don't say anything about Black Lives Matter, that is the worst possible thing that you can do. Because that position is not sustainable, because the future is with the people at the bottom of the organization. And your organizations are going to have a harder time recruiting talent to play for you, even recruiting students to enroll, if the trends that I see in my surveys hold up, which is that Gen Z takes this very seriously. They don't want to be in environments where the president of the university and the trustee board hasn't issued a statement in support of students who are standing against police brutality. They don't want to go there. They don't want to play for those kinds of organizations. So.
Well, people, keep the questions rolling in. Y'all are asking some good ones. And Alvin, you started to go down this path, so let me take you further down this path. Defund the police, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it means a variety of things. I mean, abolish the police means essentially, tear down your current police department in the way that it is and start again. That's what it means in its most practicable form. There are some utopians who believe, abolish the police, means just no police. Everyone, with your own gun or will police themselves and defend themselves. And here again, the conservative ideology and the so-called progressive ideologies somewhat line up a bit. You have people on the right who, want to abolish police and just kind of defend themselves with their long guns, right? And so that's an unworkable premise. Most Americans don't want that. We're never going to get there. Defunding means trimming police budgets in ways that will invest in the same communities that are hyper-policed, that will make it less necessary to police them in that way, right? And so as a nation, we have a militarized police. And this has happened, it's exploded exponentially since 9/11. We don't really need a fully militarized police. We don't need to be spending this much money. This is what the defund advocates say. If we would take some of that money and put it into investing jobs in low-income communities or mental health, so much of what the police are called on to do is mental health interventions that go left very quickly, right? And so part of defunding is let's defund and spend more money on mental health or services for the homeless, right? And so I think that a lot of these propositions are quite reasonable, but none of them are going to change the dynamic with policing until we deal with those root causes of the racial inequalities in the first place. And here's something that some of your listeners may find very off-putting, but I always challenge people to just Google what I say, right? since the 2010s, we have known that white supremacists have been infiltrating police departments across this nation. There was an FBI report about it in 2012. There was another one about it in 2016 or 17. And so one way to make things better is to put real screenings in place so that we stop hiring racist police officers, right? Another way that we can make things better, short of defunding, is when a police officer is fired or engages in extreme use of violence in one department, that should be a matter of public record. In the way, if you go to the doctor to get a surgery and that person butchers you, she can't just go and move to the next hospital with that record being sealed, right? Everyone knows that she has committed this egregious malpractice, right? That's another very simple reform that we could put in place. Another one is, let's make police officers liable for their inappropriate behavior, just in the way that you are. Like, we all work at universities, maybe something is done wrong and the corporate counsel will, will protect you. If that corporate counsel thinks that you've done something wrong, they won't protect you. You're on your own. You're liable for your own malfeasance. If we did that with the police, a lot of these things would change. And so these are some very common sense reforms that we can do short of defunding. But I do think that defunding is warranted. I think that we see policing, our police officers running in with bulletproof vests and helmets and, weapons of war. And these people are unarmed and they're saying, I felt threatened. Well, how does that, these are not the beat cops of the 1970s. They've got real military hardware. Why are we spending so much money on this hardware if they always then say, but I felt threatened from the guy running away from me? Or, and so it's just a preposterous situation.
Yeah, because I when you hear defund the police, I think people sometimes confuse that with abolish the police. Yes. Or just take away money so that they're ineffective. And it sounds like really what that means is, let's redistribute the resources to try to make policing better.
That's right.
Or reduce the need for policing.
That's exactly right, Alan. And the reality is, I don't see more stimulus aid coming from the federal government to deal with coronavirus. And in that reality, police are going to be defunded. Mm-hmm. And so this is where, if I had a magic wand and I could fix the Black Lives Matter movement, I would say, okay, so what do your leaders want beyond defunding? Defunding is going to have LA. When Los Angeles County was met with demands for defunding, they said, great, we're going to do this. They were already facing a tens of millions of dollars shortfall. So just slashing that out actually helps some localities who are going to be facing the threat of laying off first responders in the first place. So what else do you have, Black Lives Matter activists, beyond defund? What else do you want? What else can you negotiate for? Because frankly, that's going to start happening around the nation anyway, given our financial crises.
So football season, campuses are opening.
Yes.
Some places in the country, football season is starting.
Yes.
The combination of the distraction of other things happening in life and or the fatigue of having race discussions, whether you're white, black, anything and everything in between. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest us think about keeping the conversation going on our campuses?
Well, the conversation is going to be happening. What I'm concerned about, and I'm old school. I believe that the most effective movement for social change in the history of our country was the movement led by Dr. King and Miss Rosa Parks in the 50s and 60s. It was intentionally designed to promote change in the way that it did. People want to say, oh, the Black Lives Matter kid should be just like those people, and then we would be nicer. And then, but that's not true. They were vilified in their times. They were met with violent resistance. They were beaten, tear gassed, dogs set upon them. And so America responded violently, even to people doing things the so-called way that we want the Black Lives Matter people to do things, right? And so, so what I'm worried about though is that with no moral leadership coming from the center of the country, and what I mean by that is the White House, we are going to be headed toward a conflagration where 5 people have died. 4 white, 1 black protesters have died this summer as a result of violence with counter protesters. And I just think that we're in a very, very dangerous time, a tinderbox of a time. And so what I would hope that we could all do is channel our students into activities that push forward on the core message that Black Lives Matter wants to win on, which is police accountability and reform, but keeping them safe from the kinds of extremism and violence that we have seen plaguing the movement. If I could wave a wand and give Black Lives Matter a black woman leader that is the moral equivalent of a Dr. King, I would ask her to call for a moratorium on protests until we get to the election. I would ask her to focus on registering people to vote, focus on organizing dialogues between reformers and the opponents of reform on our campuses, right? Because I'm worried like I've not been worried before in terms of where this is headed. Mm-hmm. And I think we've all got to be attentive to that because our students are right in the thick of it.
Yeah, yeah. My wife, myself, other Black Americans, and I have said this to a colleague. I said, I'm tired. Yeah. I'm tired of having the conversation. And interestingly enough, the response from my colleague, who I respect, stopped talking to me about race because I said I was tired and I was exhausted. And I had to tell him, yeah, I'm exhausted, but I'm always willing to talk because it's necessary. Yeah. So it has become that Black and brown people are the ones who have to step into this space consistently, right? Yeah. That we have to have the conversations. We have to answer the questions. We have to tell people what books to read. We have to tell people what Netflix series to watch. And so and this question gets asked a lot, Al, and I know it's been asked of you a lot, is I'm a white student athlete. I'm a white coach. I coach all white student athletes. I'm a white middle-aged woman, not Karen, but just a middle-aged woman. I'm an older white man, and I've not had to deal with this.
Yes.
But I want to do something that's going to have an impact. What do you tell those folks who want to be allies?
I would tell them to continue to be persistent in pursuit of knowledge. I would tell, and real knowledge, not the kind of disinformation that comes on all television channels, but read, look for good sources, continue to engage with a diverse set of interlocutors. I'm actually writing a piece now about how our racial ethics needs to change. We have a fundamentally segregated society where people don't talk about race outside of their circle of intimates. And even I, as the big expert on race relations, when George Floyd started happening, I'm getting texts from like my white friends. They're like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Okay about what?" Like, because this is my job, is dealing with these inequalities. And I said, "Oh, like they're actually checking on me," And so my framework had to change. And I don't have the privilege to be tired in the crisis because my life does matter. And if I can give to a white ally or even a white opponent a stretched frame on the origins of these dilemmas and how we can deal with them, that's going to make me safer, my little Black boy and girl safer. And we've got to keep having those conversations. Now, I've been so heartened by the fact that after watching their children and grandchildren out in the streets, I have seen boomers and Gen Xers get out there in these protests. The incredibly brave, protester, the older gentleman, 75 years old, that was pushed down by police in Buffalo. What is he doing there, right? The incredibly brave veteran from Vietnam era who took a beating. I mean, these are like the equivalent of the Freedom Riders, the white folks from Wisconsin and Minnesota that rode down south with John Lewis and took beatings to advance social justice. So this is like, if they're not tired, then I can't be tired, right? But what I will say is protect your mental health. Protect your mental health and find moments of calm and isolation that are away from this, because it can be debilitating. And what I will also say is we've got to have empathy for the people that are, on like a steady diet of Fox News or what Mr. Trump is saying. I mean, they are being socialized in the ways that they think as well, right? If you grew up in segregated America and you learned, the Civil War was about tariffs and slaves were happy, and all of the poor Black people on the other side of the highway, they're there because they don't work hard, then this is dislocating. To watch your children and grandchildren saying, no, that's not what we learned in K through 12. These people are unemployed because, Eisenhower built highways to separate them from jobs. And as soon as Black people could vote in the South, all of the white people left and went to segregation academies, right? Because they didn't want the public schools integrated, right? So those conversations have been suppressed in America for 60 years. So it's exhausting to them to start having them. And this is why you get so much resistance. And so, but if we're going to stay a multiracial democracy and live together and get better, we've got to begin to get honest and value one another, and to talk constructively across these divides. And in the middle of doing that, we all have to attend to our own emotional well-being and mental health. And it's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You and I had a conversation before, and you have to forgive me. You had mentioned some papers that were written about slavery. There's a school in the Northeast who published these papers. Do you remember that conversation?
So the interpretation of slavery that most of the baby boomers got is tantamount to what you see in Gone with the Wind. And Gone with the Wind, the opening of the movie, the slaves are singing and they're happy and everyone's, and then like the Black slave who's the chambermaid, she's like super invested in Miss Scarlet's whiteness. Like, don't get dirty. Like this is the kind of narrative of slavery that was in the school books that most people in the boomer generation had. That narrative comes from a Columbia University historian called Dunning. It's called the Dunning School Theory or Hypothesis of Slavery. Since she says slaves were happy, they were well treated, they were, it was a full employment program with meal benefits, nothing to see here, right? And so that view has been completely obliterated by the historical profession since the 1970s. And what we know is that the early wealth of this country was founded upon the bodies of Black people. I think I said in a recent, so the average American in 1938 made $750. Frederick Douglass in 1820 was sold for $1,000. Wow. Right? So just think about the scope of the wealth that is locked up in the bodies of Black people. That's the wealth that took America from a backwater to the fourth richest nation in the world by the start of the Civil War. And that's why when you get to scratching at these questions about racial inequality, it doesn't take long until you're scratching at questions about capitalism. And it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Alvin, thank you. We are down to the final ticks here. Again, thank you for your time. Hope that the folks on the call have been able to learn something. And again, I love it when people say, man, I didn't think of it that way. If that can only be a comment from folks on the call, then I will call it beneficial. So as we wind down and before Bob jumps back on, are there any kind of lasting thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Just, love one another, respect one another, pray for one another. And if anyone has, I know we went fast, my email's open. I can't promise I'll respond immediately, but if you do have some questions, please just write to me and I'll try to point you to sources.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Alvin, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alvin.
Bob, you want to jump on and offer your closing remarks?
Thanks, Alan. Tremendous session. The impact of Black Lives Matter movement on a campus. Phenomenal topic, phenomenal session. Dr. Tillery, cannot thank you enough. This really fits right in with NACDA's mission statement. NACDA's mission statement is education. That's our job, to educate, to provide platforms such as this. And with these social justice topics happening every month, we're looking forward to more topics of this nature with even better discussion. And if content is there, if the membership want these twice a month, we'll go ahead and do it because they're that important to us. So to both of you, thank you very much. Remember, all of the participants, within 24 hours, you're going to get a copy of this entire segment in your email box. You'll have it. And then since the beginning, since mid-May, NACDA's had over 150 hours of programming. All of that is available on our website. So please, if you want to go back and look at any of these sessions that have been going on since mid-May, please go back and teach your staff. We know professional development dollars are far and few in between these days. So check out what's on the website right now, and you can really have some good topics and great discussions with your staff. So again, Alan, Dr. Tillery, thank you so much. And please, everybody, be safe out there.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.